So hello everyone and welcome to the second meeting of the Turba online program for spring 2024, which of course addresses the history of alchemy broadly defined. As you know, this spring we're discussing medieval and early modern alchemy. And we are, as always, fortunate to have secured the support of the Society of the History of Alchemy and Chemistry, which is providing its Zoom account for our use. Today, I would like to welcome here Professor Matteo Soranzo from McGill University. And he will be talking about a Lulian workshop in Quattrocento, Venice, preliminary findings on Cristoforo da Parigi, or rather Perugia. And just a few words about Matteo. Matteo is Associate Professor of Italian at the Department of Languages, Literatures, and Cultures at McGill University. He holds a laurea in lettere from the Università di Padova and a PhD in Italian Studies from the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He is the author of Poetry and Identity in Quattrocento Naples of 2014, as well as the Giovanni Aurelio Augurello and Renaissance Alchemy in 2019 at Brill. And of course, various chapters and articles on early Renaissance literature in Italian and Latin you can always look at on his academia.edu profile. Matteo is the director of the liberal arts program at McGill, the principal investigator of a 5-year research grant on Quattrocento alchemy funded by the Canadian government, and the curator of the annual chapter on the Quattrocento for the year's work in modern language studies published by Brill. So I would like to introduce Matteo and look forward to his presentation on Cristoforo da Parigi. So please, Matteo.
Thank you very much. So let me share the screen. Can you all see it?
Yes, we can see it.
Excellent. So very good. So without further ado, I'm gonna start. My first encounter with Cristoforo da Parigi's alchemical texts dates back to the end of November 2019. At the time, I had just returned the proof of my annotated edition of Augurello's Chrysopoeia. I had a fresh memory back then of all those curious works attributed to Thomas Aquinas, Albert the Great, Arnold of Villanova, Ramon Lull, not to mention Geber, Ortolanus, Hermes Trismegistus, woven together in Augurello's verses. So I was in a peculiar mind space when on a Friday afternoon, while browsing through the catalog of the Osler Library of Medicine here at McGill, I came across the gracefully crafted manuscript you can see on the slide. What initially enticed me was something on the catalog entry. It described the manuscript as transmitting alchemical texts written in Italian vernacular. A welcome surprise after several years almost completely devoted to Latin texts. What also got my attention, I remember, was that the catalog entry mentioned Venice as the place and late Quattrocento as the date of production. When I realized that the Osler manuscripts were temporarily shelved at the campus library, literally across the street from my office, I had no excuse left. I decided to go and get a hold on this well-preserved codex. To my great surprise, the manuscript was written in a neat humanistic script and an easily understandable form of Quattrocento Koine. Quattrocento Koine, as you may know, is the eclectic form of vernacular used in written communication before Italian's gradual standardization, which started in the second decade of the 16th century. Like other Quattrocento Koine texts I had read before, Cristoforo's words struck me for the witty blend of Tuscan expressions, frequent Latinisms, and regional characteristics, including nouns and verbs borrowed from the Venetian dialect. As I was flipping through the manuscript, two questions began to take shape in my mind. How come I'd never come across Cristoforo, Summetta, Lucidario, Violetta, and the other texts included in this codex? And how come that the secondary literature on late medieval and early modern alchemy, with which I was becoming familiar, did not single out this author, who wrote so clearly about the philosophical mercury, elixir, the philosopher's stone, with extensive quotations from Aristotle, Avicenna, Arnaldo Villanova, Ramon Lull, and many other great names in the Chemical Hall of Fame. But what really hooked me was a section from the prologue of Cristoforo Summetta. Like all the other texts attributed to Cristoforo, as we will discuss in a few minutes, the Summetta reads as the expanded version of a letter Cristoforo presumably sent from Paris to his friend Andrea Ognibene, a Venetian citizen described as falling into some kind of financial trouble. The epistolary genre, as I'm sure you all know very well, is not unusual in alchemical literature. Arnaldo Villanova's letters to Jacopo da Toledo or Pope Boniface VIII, just to name a couple of examples, are influential models, which our Cristoforo explicitly quotes throughout his written corpus. What really struck me, however, was the story the prologue of the Summetta tells. This is a short summary. After expressing his love and friendship to Andrea Ognibene, Cristoforo relates a moment of spiritual turmoil arising from his daughter's decision to become a nun. Emotionally distraught, unable to work on his alchemy, Cristoforo falls into a state of utter dejection. But on December 15th, lo and behold, Saint Francis of Assisi appears to him in a dream. Saint Francis, one learns from a long reported direct speech, is outraged at Cristoforo's sinful conduct, so much that the usually peaceful saint breaks apart Cristoforo's alchemical tools, invites him to repent, and warns him about the mortal dangers arising from questioning God's will. Cristoforo wakes up from the dream understandably shaken, only to find his alchemical apparecchio really broken apart. At this point, things take on a rather gory turn. In the quotation on the slide, Cristoforo, after prostrating on the ground and reciting the Miserere, grabs a scourge, disciplina, and whips himself into a bloody mess. The harsh penitential ritual, we learn, works. Having realigned his will with the Lord's, Cristoforo is ready to start working again. He commits to obtain 4 ounces of gold's sulfur, from which he expects to draw the equivalent of 800,000 ducati, a truly remarkable sum. The rest of the Summetta sets out to instruct Andrea Ognibene on how to do the same from a theoretical and practical point of view. After reading this, as you can imagine, Cristoforo's text had definitely earned my attention. Before leaving the library, I arranged with our curator at McGill to have the manuscript digitized and promised myself to spend some time on it. Only a few weeks later, COVID hit, and with the pandemic came the lockdowns, online teaching, homeschooling, and all the other amenities we all remember so well. But all those long hours trapped in my home were not a complete waste of time. I was able to transcribe the Osler manuscript in its entirety, while also fiddling around with library catalogs, the Iter Italicum, and various databases such as Manus Online, Calliope, Manuscripta Medievalia, and of course the Alchemy website. To my great surprise, I was able to populate a list of 69 manuscripts transmitting texts attributed to Cristoforo, including translations in German, Spanish, and Latin. Traveling back then was still rather complicated, so I had to rely for the most part on digitized copies available online or purchased directly from the libraries when some of their services resumed. This allowed me to identify at least 3 recurring typologies of manuscripts in my still growing census, namely single author manuscripts transmitting exclusively one, as the Brescia manuscript on the slide, or a corpus of texts attributed to Cristoforo. 2 anthologies of alchemical texts, which include 1 or more texts attributed to Cristoforo alongside other authors. And finally, miscellaneous of heterogeneous texts, which include sections from Cristoforo's texts. You can see one example of each typology on the slide. And then the pandemic ended, travel resumed, and to my great joy, I was granted a sabbatical year, which I had the chance to spend based in Italy. Direct examination of manuscripts stored in Venice, Florence, Pavia, Milan, Munich, Erlangen, Brescia, Bergamo, Vienna, and other European cities allowed me to test my initial hypothesis, add numerous items to my census, and draw some general observations on the manuscript transmission of Cristoforo's texts. This is more or less what I was able to establish. Single author manuscripts repropose, with minor variations, what I propose to call Cristoforo's canon. That is, a group of texts including, often in this order, the Summetta dell'arte trasmutatoria, a shorter treatise going under the name of Violetta, Chitara, or Medulla della Summetta, a longer and more demanding treatise entitled Lucidario dell'arte trasmutatoria, or more simply Lucidario, a body of letters to and from Andrea Ognibene. With this basic canon of 3 treatises and a body of letters, individual manuscripts occasionally add 2 texts, namely the Pratica del Fioso, a short operative manual, and the Apertorio Alfabetale, a short introduction to the alphabets placed, as we will have the chance to see, at the end of the Summetta and the Lucidario. Anthologies, as far as I was able to verify, draw from this tentative canon, as also do the aforementioned miscellaneous. There are, however, 2 notable caveats. At the end of the Lucidario, and within the Summetta and Violetta, Cristoforo mentions a larger work of his, probably written in Latin, that he refrains from sending to Andrea Ognibene, possibly because of his address's linguistic incompetence. I was not able to identify this hypothetical Latin work, possibly entitled Summa or Summa Maior. Later scribes often identify this Summa Maior with Cristoforo Lucidario, but this cannot be the case since the Lucidario, as you can see on the slide, makes reference to this mysterious larger work. So it cannot be excluded that there may be a relatively large treatise in Latin entitled Summa, compatible with the rest of Cristoforo's canon out there. Second caveat, 2 miscellaneous, that is Florence, Biblioteca Nazionale 2325 and Venice, Italiano 455, transmit and attribute to Cristoforo or Andrea Ognibene a poem in vernacular on the philosopher's stone, whose incipit is 4 principi sono naturali. Nature's first principles are 4. Given that both manuscripts were copied at the end of the 16th century, the poem may be a later addition to Cristoforo's canon. At the moment, I do not have a solution to these puzzles, but I thought I would bring them to your attention nevertheless. My iter d'Italicum, or Europeum, so to speak, also allowed me to observe how a few manuscripts from each of the aforementioned categories are signed and dated by occasionally laudable scribes or compilers. I have quite a bit of material of this kind. Today, however, I will limit myself to share scribal notes and colophons from 2 notable items of my census. The first is manuscript Vienna 5510, compiled, dated, and signed by Austrian scientist and bibliophile Nicolaus Poll in 1494. Among other things, Nicolaus Poll's manuscript gives us information on where the copies he consulted were, naming an elusive Venetian named Cristoforo, known for his considerable collection of Lullian manuscripts. The second is a manuscript stored in Venice, compiled, dated, and signed by Treviso scribe and man of learning Antonio Luigi Rosciolini in 1507. Like Nicolaus Poll, Antonio Luigi Rosciolini claimed to have copied his manuscripts in Venice. Rosciolini, moreover, claims to have based his copy on the author's original. Based on the first results of the collation that I'm currently conducting, moreover, both the texts Poll's and Rosciolini's manuscripts transmitted appear to be closely related and possibly based on a common exemplar. At the current state of my research, I'm not ready to draw a reliable stemma codicum. However, I would like to propose a prudent hypothesis. The colophons of the oldest manuscripts of my census suggest that Cristoforo's corpus originally took shape in Venice at the end of the Quattrocento in some sort of Lowlian workshop, as that evoked in the title of my presentation. That the 1489 exemplar mentioned by Rosciolini is also mentioned in the colophon of a later manuscript crafted in 1526 may further substantiate this hypothesis. The collation I'm currently conducting appears to confirm these initial observations. In the last few months, I have paid special attention to the text of Cristoforo's Summetta. With the help of two assistants, I have transcribed about 20 manuscripts transmitting this text using the platform Transcribus. After cleaning, dividing, and aligning the transcriptions, I proceeded to collate them using Crisocollate, which is a very good collation software, I have to say. The examination of about 2,000 variant locations allowed me to identify at least one family of manuscripts presenting common characteristics. Once again, I'm not ready to share a safely established stemma codicum. However, it appears that from a hypothetical archetype omega, at least three families can be drawn, one of which, alpha, comprises manuscript EMOSW. As mentioned earlier, the scribes of two manuscripts from this family, Venice and Vienna, declare to have drawn their copy from an older codex crafted in 1489. Is this manuscript, which I have not been able to identify, closer to the omega archetype? At the moment, I don't know. For the sake of this presentation, however, the quotations from Cristoforo's works that follow are all drawn from a text that I established based on the manuscripts comprised in what I call the alpha family. The texts that form Cristoforo's canon present multiple points of entry. One is, of course, the alchemical doctrine that, with remarkable internal consistency and changing degrees of complexity, all the texts in the canon contribute to outline. On the slide, you can see the definition of lapis philosophorum found in the theoretical part of Cristoforo's Summetta. This is the theoretical context of the definition. In a conversation with Geber's Summa Perfectionis, Cristoforo constructs alchemy as partly natural and partly artificial. The artist, in other words, conducts in the laboratory what nature does in the bowels of the earth. In a close dialogue with Arnaldo Villanova's Rosarium Philosophorum and Lowell's Testamentum, Cristoforo emphasizes the role corrosive waters play in the operation, with particular emphasis on what he calls Mercurio Maggiore, higher mercury, or Mercurio Nostro, our mercury. Combined with gold or silver, this special kind of mercury, not to be confused with its vulgar homonym, has wondrous properties. It allows to extract a kind of sulfur, not to be confused with vulgar sulfur, out of gold and silver. Triggers these metals vis germinativa, germinating virtue, and leads to the production of elixir or lapis philosophorum, which Cristoforo, using the language of Aristotle's substance theory, constructs as the potential and actual forms of the same substance. The philosopher's stone, which Cristoforo also calls medicine, has metallurgical and medical applications at the same time. How Cristoforo's texts communicate the aforementioned doctrinal content, in my opinion, is more interesting than the content itself. A defining feature of Cristoforo's texts is their complex intertextuality, which encompasses scriptural, patristic, and, of course, natural philosophical and alchemical sources. A representative specimen is found in the closing chapter of the theoretical part of the Summetta. In outline, the Theorica of the Summetta comprises the prologue, a moral examination of three mortal sins and two obstacles that compromise the operation's success, 6 definitions of the main components at work in the art of transmutation, namely elixir, lapis, alchemia, menstrua, mercury, and sulfury. The summary, a refutation of 3 arguments commonly adduced against the science of transmutation. 2 demonstrations, namely that alchemy is true based on natural reason, and that elixir is natural. I would like to look closely at the closing chapter of the theoretical section with specific attention to its intertextuality. As you can see on the slide, in this passage Cristoforo is reiterating how the elixir or eccellente medicina discussed in the Summeta is made out of sulfur and mercury. To confirm this claim, which forms the doctrinal core of the treatise, the passage incorporates a substantial quotation from the fourth book of Aristotle's Meteora, the treatise that, as you all certainly know, was traditionally confused with the Latin translation of an Arabic work on mineralogy, conventionally referred to as Avicenna's De Congelazione et Conglutinatione. That Cristoforo quotes from this very famous text is unsurprising. What strikes one as peculiar, however, is how inaccurate and manipulative Cristoforo's quotation is. The word elixir, to begin with, never appears in the declared source. Cristoforo uses it to replace what, in the base text, is simply designated as res optima, that is, pure sulfur out of which alchemists can obtain gold. Now, is Cristoforo intentionally forcing the base text to fit the alchemical doctrine described in the Summeta by adding to the quotation words not found in it? Or perhaps is he relying on a manuscript version of this very popular text that proposed to associate Avicenna's sulfur optimum with elixir? Or perhaps a combination of these two potential scenarios? In this sense, the phrase hic capitur elixir reads as what may have originally been a gloss, which Cristoforo's quotation, or a copy transcribed by a distracted copyist, appears to incorporate and implicitly attribute to Aristotle himself. Cases of this kind abound in Cristoforo's texts. Another, and at least for me, unique feature of Cristoforo's corpus is the way it transmits knowledge by means of what I propose to call epistolary fiction. The example on the slide is drawn from the Summeta, but my observations also apply to the Violetta and the Lucidario. The Summeta, as mentioned earlier, is conceived as a letter sent from Paris to Venice. From the opening and closing lines of the text, one learns that Cristoforo entrusts the text to a messenger, whose initials are, with considerable variations among extant manuscripts, F and O. Like the Lucidario and the Violetta, the Summeta is meant to be exceptionally clear and straightforward. This is all good, one learns from Cristoforo's texts, as this clarity sets the text apart from the confusing allegories of pre-Christian authors. Also, this matches the work of divinely inspired Christians such as Arnold of Villanova and Ramon Lull. Cristoforo's most quoted authorities. Building on an established topos in alchemical literature, meanwhile, Cristoforo perceives clarity as dangerous in case his letter were to fall in the wrong hands. Hence, the need to encrypt the practical section of Summeta with an alphabetical system, the key to which is a complex alphabeto the author declares to have sent with a different letter and entrusted to another faithful, albeit less discerning, messenger. You certainly know the use of a more or less extended alphabet as a mnemotechnic device is found in the practical section of Loll's Testamentum, as Cristoforo punctually acknowledges elsewhere in the corpus. But Cristoforo does not simply borrow a textual tactic found in one of his most quoted sources. In fact, Cristoforo's epistolary fiction dramatizes the genesis of the Summeta and turns the transmission of alchemical knowledge into a vivid story, which involves transalpine travels, letters, messengers, and, if one delves further into the other letters included in Cristoforo's canon, shady interceptors, broken and lost tools, and personal hardships of all kinds. What can we make of this remarkable propensity for narrativization? At the current state of my research, I'm still far from an overall assessment of Cristoforo's corpus, rhetorical strategies, and sources. Further to my observations on narrativizations, I would simply like to single out a couple of passages hinting at specific experiences in the author's life. In the Lucidario, for example, Cristoforo uses glassmaking to illustrate one of the three forms of the alchemical magisterium alongside pharmacy and metallurgy. To do so, the author praises the founder of the prestigious Scuola di Rialto, Paolo della Pergola. He recalls having seen this famous Aristotelian philosopher, or at least his inventions, at work in Murano and praises his innovations in the art of glassmaking. This information matches other extant records concerning Paolo della Pergola, a scholar often associated with pioneering Murano glassmaker Angelo Barovier. Elsewhere in the Lucidario, Cristoforo illustrates the wondrous property of quintessence when one draws the substance from gold, the king of all metals, with the help of the Mercurio Maggiore or philosophical Mercury. To do so, Cristoforo relates how, earlier on in his life, he was in Rome, where he witnessed the finding of an ancient jar of perfume. Notwithstanding the passage of time, thanks to the quintessence of gold, the perfume preserved its fragrance, a prodigy that left the author and the other observers dumbfounded. At the moment, I prefer to be agnostic as to whether this biographical information are to be taken at face value or not. Borrowing a useful category from the field of narratology, I use Cristoforo da Parigi as the name of an implied author, that is, the fictional persona confined within the boundaries of the text. As a rhetorical tactic, the use of first-person accounts in the context of a technical treatise is significant. It points to that emphasis on lived experience that, as Chiara Crisciani has persuasively illustrated, defines alchemy and other disciplines such as, for instance, surgery, notable for the dubious place they had in the academic hierarchy of disciplines. Also, one may suggest that Cristoforo's propensity for narrativization may stem from his knowledge not only of Lowell's theories, but also the legendary biography alchemical writers associated with the medieval philosophy. Whether the fictional Cristoforo and the overall epistolary fiction staged in the corpus overlap with real people and events, Cristoforo's identity constitutes a fascinating puzzle. I would like to conclude this presentation with some recent findings, which I hope may shed some light on this mystery. I will start from Cristoforo's addressee, Andrea Ognibene. In volume 9 of Tassini's Cittadinanze, found at the Archivio di Stato of Venice, I was able to verify the existence of an Andrea Ognibene, son of Orlando, from the Sestiere of San Marcuola. Tassini also records that in 1482 the same Andrea Ognibene was a member of the Confraternita of Santa Maria della Misericordia. Upon examination of the matricula or mariegola of this confraternity, I was able to verify Tassini's information. Andrea Ognibene was indeed a standing member of this confraternity known, among other things, for its severe spirituality and use of self-flagellation as a penitential practice. Is this a clue to the harsh ritual described in the prologue of Cristoforo's Sumeta? Furthermore, Cristoforo and Andrea Ognibene appear in a curious record of a transmutation performed in Venice in 1468. In at least 3 manuscripts transmitting Cristoforo's works, a scribal note signed by a certain Bertuccio Loredan informs readers about the remarkable feat. I cannot vouch for the authenticity of this declaration. However, you may want to know that Bertuccio Loredan did live in this time frame. A member of the prominent Loredan family, Bertuccio served in a minor office called Kazuda, which handled small cases of insolvency and bankruptcy in Venice. Insufficient as they are to establish the truthfulness of the narrative inscribed in Cristoforo's corpus, these findings may at least speak to a narrative intentionally based on actual characters and true events. Which brings us to the elusive identity of Cristoforo himself. The epithet from Paris or Parisian, Parisinus, is a real puzzle. Why would a Frenchman write in Italian and show such familiarity with Venice and its territory, for instance? And how come that, as far as I was able to verify, no Cristoforo, nicknamed Parisinus, ever shows up in other documents except those collected in the corpus? For the sake of clarity, let's say that there are 2 main camps on this matter, on which some prominent scholars have weighed in the past. The first camp, which one can trace back to Lynn Thorndike, is what I call the fictionalist party. Whether, as Thorndike suspected, the whole corpus is a hoax or a body of text circulating, as in the case of Arnaldo Villanova or Ramon Lull under a pseudonym, fictionalists approach Cristoforo da Parigi as a textual function used to organize and transmit a body of doctrines in the form of a fictional exchange. If the whole thing is made up, however, how can one explain the numerous allusions to real people and places discussed before? The other camp, inaugurated, as far as I know, by Michela Pereira, is what I call the realist party. For realists, the corpus is indeed the work of a skilled writer and alchemist named Cristoforo. The epithet of Parigino, or from Paris, however, is the result of a scribal error that one can rectify by looking at Nicolaus Paul's manuscript mentioned earlier. In the table of contents, this codex does qualify Cristoforo as Parusinus, which can also mean from Perugia. Although elsewhere in the same manuscript, one finds the unambiguous qualifier Parisiensis and the phrase da Parigi. If that is the case, however, why would Cristoforo's letters be sent from Paris in France, of all places? Incidit in skillam qui vult carebdim vitare. So I hope you can all forgive me if, for now, I prefer to err on the side of caution and refrain from taking side on this puzzle, which I hope, nevertheless, you find as interesting as I certainly do. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you very much, Matteo. Let me put this back. And if you can stop sharing your screen.
Here we go.
Yes. Well, thank you so much for sharing this very interesting initial findings on Cristoforo. Of course, you know, there have been many people wondering, is this person French or Italian? And of course, it always sounded like he was Italian, but you know, there's always this question mark. And I think later on in the 17th century, people in France assumed that he was French, and they picked up on this term of Paris. So he became more somehow more associated also with French alchemy. But this is very interesting, and I wanted to just ask. I mean, this schola you mentioned is it's basically a friary. I mean, these are friars that we're discussing, like Franciscan friars, or what is it exactly?
Yeah, so Santa Maria della Misericordia. So is a confraternity. It doesn't include only religious people, friars, but it's also like a group that gathered working people from Venice, like there's lay members, religious people as well, and it kind of like organized life and work and was basically an association. It was based on prayers and also like the following of certain regimented customs. But these people also had members of a confraternity or a scuola, as they're called in Venice, could also be lay people with a family of their own and careers. So Andrea Onibene does show up in the Mariegola, which is the Venetian dialect version of the Matricula, which was this book that gathered all the names of the people who were members of the confraternita, and also like regulations that in time were added to the statutes of the confraternity. So I don't know if Cristoforo himself was a member of the Confraternita, in the sense that when I was browsing through the Mariegole, I singled out a few Cristoforos, let's say, but there was nothing else attached to the name. So it was not Cristoforo da Perugia or Cristoforo P or something that might suggest the identification. So once again, I'm kind of like erring on the side of caution. But I think that the kind of environment of the confraternita, which was a confraternita of battuti, so battuti means kind of like flagellants, might sort of like shed some light or offer some context to the rather curious prologue of the Sumeta.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for clarifying this. And yes, of course, I want to open the floor to questions. I might have some as well a bit later on, but for now, Jenny Rampling has a question. So please, Jenny.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me?
Yes,
Yes.
loud and clear.
Perfect. Good. Thank you so much for the talk. I'm very pleased you're working on Cristoforo because I've worked on him a little bit over the years because I'm interested in the reception of pseudo-Lullian alchemy, and of course he's a big figure there, but I've mostly focused on Ripley, so I'm actually very happy that someone else is kind of taken up the Cristoforo baton. But I do have a question about how he is reading the pseudo-Lullian corpus.
Yes.
And if please forgive me, indulge me for a moment if I briefly summarize something that I argued, because I'm interested to know if that's something that you've noticed as well, or if you're finding something different. And that is that, and I've written a little bit about this in my book, the way that commentators on pseudo-Lullian texts, especially Ripley, try to make sense of the differences between them is to assume that lull means different things. Well, he means the same thing, but he uses different expressions to say that thing. So there has to be a certain amount of textual glossing and substituting words from one part of the corpus into another part of the corpus in order to reconcile these different works, which are supposed to be by the same author, Raymond. Now, you mentioned something that sounded very similar in your presentation, where you noticed that Cristoforo was glossing, or let's just say substituting certain words like water for other words like elixir. And that's exactly what I've seen Ripley doing when he also tries to reconcile seemingly contradictory primary sources. And my own guess was that this was a combination of two things, which is, first of all, simple philological work trying to reconcile the text, but secondly, it might also represent the evidence of practice. And in your talk, you didn't say much about the practice. So I wonder, can you say a little bit about your sense of Cristoforo as someone who might have actually practiced alchemy? Is he trying to reconcile what he reads with what he has seen or done or made? Or is it just a textual reconciliation? What's your sense from reading the text? Thank you, and apologies for the long question.
No, thank you. This is like an excellent question, and it raises like a number of kind of like points that I observed in reading Cristoforo's corpus. So, first of all, in terms of practice versus theory, one of the impediments that Cristoforo lists that would hinder the achievement of the Philosopher's Stone is to rely too much on books. This is like preached in the theoretical part, but is also applied in the practical section of the Sumeta, in the sense that there are moments when Cristoforo says that now he has to part from Lull, because even if Lull is the Duca Nostro, so our leader, he doesn't know anything because he's only a man. Okay? And therefore somebody has to test sort of like his ideas on the practice of argument. This regards mainly what Lull might have meant by using certain words like mercury, for example. And here it appears to me that Cristoforo is answering to a polemical context. So it kind of like keeps on mentioning, as some sort of like a polemical straw man, detractors that say that Lull's corpus cannot be followed because it's filled with contradictions. One of which is that he uses Mercury to mean two different things. So the apology or the kind of like justification that Cristoforo offers to this is that the contradiction is in the eyes of the beholder. So if somebody actually knows what Lull has to say, Mercury does mean different things. So there is a vulgar Mercury, for instance, which is very different from the Mercurio Maggiore or our Mercury, which indeed can be used to extract philosophical sulfur from gold in the making of the Philosopher's Stone. So there is a lot of clarification of what Lull actually means in specific passages, mainly, as I was able to see, from the Testamentum, but also the Questionarium is another Lullian work that Cristoforo seems to follow very closely. Anyway, there is a part of his work on Lull that is textual. So what does he really mean is that to shield the Lullian corpus from the criticism of some of his contemporaries. At the same time, like the kind of validity of Lullian ideas is tested in the workshop. Like there is a pretty detailed series of instructions on how to realize this Mercurio Maggiore, which is this crucial component in the kind of like operation that is described in Sumeta, for instance. And this does not completely correspond with what we read in the Testamento. Hence the need to kind of like handle the Testamentum critically. And kind of like contrasting it, if necessary, with the actual practice of the laboratory. I hope this answers the question. Of course, I'm still kind of like trying to establish a reliable text.
Yeah.
And my kind of like analysis of the quotations is based on notes. So I haven't gone in great length into that component of my project.
No, that's a very helpful answer. Thank you.
Okay.
A question now from Alexander Engerhofer. Alexander, please.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
All right. So yeah, I have actually a similar question to Jennifer. And you actually did mention that he has a practical part in his manuscript or in his treatise that deals with making gold or making this philosophical mercury. When you look at this recipe, is it something that is practical in the sense that you could reproduce this in a laboratory setting, or is it still very philosophical where he uses dicnamen for various ingredients?
I didn't realize if you were asking me. Okay. No, he uses very specific names of ingredients. The part that is quite interesting is that in the practical parts, all the name of the ingredients, the dicnamen, are replaced by letters of the alphabet. So this is the part of the Sumeta that is encrypted. So in order to decrypt, so to speak, this part of the Sumeta, one needs to kind of like have access to the Alfabeto della Sumeta, which is like an appendix that, once again, in the epistolary fiction of the corpus, Cristoforo declares to have sent with a different messenger, or in a different letter. And of course, like the letters correspond to what are presumably substances somebody can find, from salniter to vitriol to, mercury, at least like the quicksilver or the vulgar mercury is discussing about. So To tell you the truth, I haven't tried to replicate any of the processes, but based on my understanding of the practical part of it, they are pretty straightforward recipes using ingredients that are not particularly abstract. Something that caught my attention is that also because it presents this interesting analogy with Augurello, is that a great deal of emphasis is placed on the use of gold as the key ingredient for making the Philosopher's Stone. So from gold only, with the help of Mercurio Maggiore, somebody can extract the sulfure solare, the solar sulfur, which by further processing can turn into the Philosopher's Stone. So the kind of like emphasis on gold only is something that caught my attention in the practical part of the text.
Thank you very much. So maybe I can ask another question. So how much of a distribution did the Samhita get after, I guess it was first written? When you mentioned that you had multiple manuscripts in various different places, how far did it distribute over, I guess, Western Europe, maybe even beyond?
Yeah, so this is a great question, and to tell you the truth, I keep on getting surprised about the distribution of this text in time, in the sense that I have a couple of manuscripts on my census that are like late 17th century. One of which, the Munich manuscript that I had reproduced in one of the slides, is actually a very neatly crafted copy that shows a scribe that was very attentive to Cristoforo's, for instance, internal partitions, in the sense that the text of the Summeta and the Lucidario and the Violeta is preceded by a very detailed table of contents with summary of each chapters. They're also very easy to read because by then Italian was much more standardized, similar to present-day Italian. So, in that case of the Munich manuscript, one have the sense of a scribe that was really engaged with Cristoforo's texts and their content. In terms of kind of like a geographical reach, I found Spanish translations, one of which ended up in Florence. I found a German translation of the Lucidarium, I guess it would be Lucidarium. So even like in other languages, there's appeared to have been a considerable interest on Cristoforo's text. Also, and here we get into the typology of the manuscripts that transmit Cristoforo's works. There are like a lot of kind of like alchemical zibaldoni, like of better words. So kind of like personal miscellanies of, practicing alchemist or erudite that simply takes the parts from Cristoforo's text as recipes and kind of like insert them in recipe books. However, even in this typology of manuscript, which I find quite unpleasant to read, to tell you the truth, the copyist tends to credit Cristoforo for the recipe itself. So there is some sort of like respect for his authorship of certain ways of, for instance, concocting the menstrui that are so crucial in Cristoforo's operation.
Very interesting. Thank you.
Okay, other questions? I will take further questions. I mean, I do have a question about the use of gold, because it seems like it's very widespread in at least in northern Italy during this period, and obviously I think of I think of Ficino, as well, and of course Augurelli, and And I'm also wondering about the relationships. You know, there are relationships, and you know, whether it's a widespread assumption during this period, let's say end of the 15th, beginning of the 16th century, that you should begin your processes by using gold in order to get to the philosopher's stone.
Yeah, so this is a great question. I have to say that when I was working on Augurello, I relied a lot on the work of Sylvain Maton, of course, which is truly excellent, by the way. And from his work, it appears that such emphasis on gold is very much a late 15th, early 16th century innovation, which was, promoted or made prominent largely thanks to Augurello's elaboration of selected passages from Ficino's De Vita. Now, Cristoforo would be an interesting precedent if we accept this chronology. However, I promise myself when I start working on the sources of Cristoforo to kind of like go backward and see if such emphasis on gold as in the process is something that is prominent also among late medieval authors that Cristoforo quotes so often in his texts. So I promised myself to kind of like move a little bit backward and out of my comfort zone, kind of like an early modernist, and try to see sort of like if this gold only emphasis is also found in late medieval text. I suspect it is, but I kind of like I'm not ready to answer that completely, you know. I saw Jennifer Rampling wrote something very interesting on the chat, and yes, so yes, the use of gold as a ferment is very common in 14th and especially 15th century alchemy. So very, very good. I mean, if you don't mind, I will kind of like ask you some advice on kind of like how to organize my research on sources then.
Please do. So gold and silver are the two great ingredients of a lot of late medieval alchemy alongside the mercury. It's absolutely central to Ripley's alchemy. He's actually getting a lot of that out of the pseudolelian corpus. But sometimes the gold isn't gold. It's like mercury, it can be another name as well. But I'm very happy if you want to send me an email to talk more about that.
Absolutely. I mean, related with gold, there is also like Cristoforo's emphasis on the vis germinativa, and which brings about a lot of very interesting kind of like botanical metaphors to describe the kind of like extraction of the philosopher's stone. And of course, you know, after I've spent quite a bit of time on Augurello, which uses this vegetal or botanical metaphor so often, I found a very interesting assonance there. So it's another kind of like a motif that Cristoforo uses frequently that I promised myself to kind of like explore in further depth.
Yep, you will find that in the pseudolelian corpus as well.
I'm actually wondering if you could comment on the language that in comparison between Cristoforo and Augurello. I mean, obviously Augurello is a you know, it's at a different level. It's a poet, you know, he writes in, you know, Latin that is very humanistic or oriented, but maybe you can make some comments on this aspect. And of course, just briefly, talk about Augurello, whom may not be known to participants here, because he's also very interesting and very influential writer on alchemy. Although, of course, the question is whether he actually practiced or not, but that's another separate question.
Yeah, so that's a great question. I mean, based on personal notes on Cristoforo's corpus, I think that linguistically speaking, they are like pursuing opposite projects, opposite operations, in the sense that Augurello systematically shy away from technical terms. Like his effort is to kind of like write a poem that is modeled on Virgil's Georgics and kind of like a classical Latinity, kind of like staying away from any kind of like medieval farraginous or technicisms, you know. Whereas Cristoforo, in writing his kind of like in the vernacular, uses a lot of technical language from scholastic philosophy. This is like an aspect that has caught my attention in a number of occasions. Like, for instance, when Cristoforo is refuting some of these sophistical arguments adduced against alchemy, okay, he uses plenty of jargon from formal logic. For instance, in kind of like the parts of a syllogism. And kind of like is splitting an argument in its different parts, the maggiore, the minore, which is something that is very different from kind of like Augurello's mindset, you know, and is quite interestingly similar to the kind of like school of Paolo della Pergola, the Scuola di Rialto. Paolo della Pergola is also a character that is mentioned in Cristoforo's corpus. So we have the feeling of somebody who had extensive scholastic training. And it's kind of like translating that sort of like vocabulary, but also like argumentative structures into his vernacular. I mean, I have, as I go through the text during the collation, I'm compiling a list of kind of interesting words, for instance, and definitely like the technicisms borrowed from scholastic Latin and adapted to the vernacular occupy a very interesting category in the list that I'm compiling.
What would you say that means? I mean, does it imply that Cristoforo was university trained, or does it imply that this kind of scholastic training was more pervasive in society and more present in amongst, let's say, this kind of confraternities or fraternities in this period and in this area?
No, I think that it says something about Cristoforo, who signed as Cristoforo this corpus of writings, in the sense that we have the blueprint of a university trained person, perhaps somebody with a bachelor in liberal arts, but definitely somebody who spent quite a bit of time on scholastic works. Like Aquinas is quoted fairly frequently, you know, as well as yeah, as well as Aristotle. So we have the idea of somebody who kind of like had a philosophical training. And in my experience with texts written in the vernacular, this is not necessarily the case. It's not something that is that obvious. So it's a clue to Cristoforo's possible identity, I think.
But I
Because,
think it's also interesting that he would choose vernacular in this case rather than writing in Latin, since he's so well trained in scholastic philosophy.
Yeah, if you want, you know, and here I kind of like I'm gonna speak as an Italianist, which is probably my comfort zone, in the sense that in Italian vernacular literature, there is a very interesting tradition that starts with Dante, with the banquet, of sort of like skilled divulgation of ideas that were otherwise confined to the academia. So in a way, Cristoforo kind of like is following in Dante's footsteps. Also, this is a clue that comes from the title of the Lucidario, for instance. Lucidario, and that's something that Cristoforo declares explicitly, is the title of Lucidario di Teologia, which is a vernacular text from the late Middle Ages, which kind of like broke down in the vernacular, sort of like key concepts in, if you want, Aquinas theology for the kind of like a lay reader. And in a way, just in terms of a genre and in terms of kind of like the model announced by the title of the Lucidario, Cristoforo is kind of like building in that sort of like tradition of, generous divulgation of academic topics for an audience of, semi-literate people.
Mhm. Okay, well, I'm realizing we're out of time. Of course, there are many questions, and we of course look forward to hearing more about Cristoforo as you come across him and you go through the manuscripts. This is an exciting project, and we look forward to, as I understand it, critical edition at some point, and if you, well, whenever that
Yes,
happens, yeah.
Yes, so that's the first step in the sense that I want to kind of like be able to establish a reliable text. And, of course, as I establish the text, I will also like work on sources and I plan to take it from there. So to sort of like, and hopefully find out who this Cristoforo was. I promised myself to spend more time in Venice at the Archivio di Stato. It's definitely where I believe that further information on the identity of this curious author might be hidden.
Mhm.
But thank you very much for having me. It was a great honor, and of course, if you ever come across manuscripts of Cristoforo da Parigi, allusions and things like that, please sort of like send it along. Like I'm kind of like the research is still ongoing.
Mhm. Well, thank you very much. It was a very interesting presentation. And I would like to invite you for the next session, which will be in 3 weeks, so not in 2 weeks, but in 3 weeks. It will be, if I'm correct, on the 17th of May. And then we will be welcoming Umberto Veronesi from Vicarte in Lisbon. And he will be talking about the archaeology of alchemy and chemistry. So I hope you will join me for that. And once again, thank you, Matteo, and thank you everyone for participating. So, and have a great weekend as well, of course. Thank you.
Thank you very
Bye-bye.
much again. Bye-bye.
Bye.